If you love your bike, you probably care about keeping it safe. I personally have had bikes stolen, and so have several people that I know. One friend even had their bike stolen right off their bike rack, which is why today I'm going to be going over 5 tips for securing your bike to your vehicle while out and about. I'm going to be demonstrating it on my 2019 Atlas and my Thule bike rack. So there's not really a way to make your locking system completely impenetrable, but if you follow these tips, it will be far more likely that a thief will either be caught when trying to steal your bike, or better yet, just move on to the next bike. So as we go through these, think about using this advice to make stealing your bike as hard as possible while applying the tips to your particular rack and vehicle combination. Tip number 1, don't use cable locks. I've seen many bike racks come with some sort of cable locking system, and I know that seems really cost effective, but please don't do that. Many videos on YouTube have demonstrated just how easy it is to cut these cables, with maybe a few exceptions, one being a very thick cable, but then you're losing the cost benefit, and I would argue that those very thick cables probably aren't as flexible as their thinner counterparts. Instead, get a security chain. They aren't cheap and they're a little heavy, but what you're getting is a much more secure way to lock your bike. Look at this chain from Avis, for example. With normal human strength, it's very unlikely that anyone was going to cut this with bolt cutters, which leaves using a grinder. That's going to be a much better deterrent because it will be loud, drawing a lot of attention. That said, nothing can really keep out a determined thief, but you stand a much better chance with a chain than you do with a cable. I use this Avis lock because the links on the end fit inside of each other like that, allowing you to use a wider variety of padlocks because you don't need as big of a shackle. Tip number 2, use a quality lock. Most locks, and probably any lock off the shelf like at a big box store, can be pretty easily picked with small concealable tools that even a beginner could use. That's why I would recommend a more expensive lock. A very good lock is the Avis 3780 Granite. I'll talk more about this at the very end of the video, but for my purposes, I feel a less expensive lock is acceptable. That's why I use this Avis 2080 discus lock. The locking mechanism on the inside is what's called a disc detainer. It requires more specialized tools and a much greater level of skill. I'm not locking up a $10,000 bike, so I doubt anyone with that kind of a skill set is going to bother with my bike. I also ensure that the front of the lock is difficult to access, so the threat of picking isn't very high. Before we get into tip number 3, if you're finding value in this video, please don't forget to like and subscribe. It would really help our channel. Tip number 3, think about all the different parts of your bike. So for example, with your chain, wrap it through both your rear wheel and your frame. Then also consider a secondary lock. I know I said to stay away from cable locks, but as a secondary lock, you could consider wrapping a cable lock through your front wheel and locking it to your frame. Tip number 4, your entire locking setup is only as strong as the weakest part. So try to wrap your chain around the strongest part of the vehicle that you can access. Ideally, you would be wrapping your chain around some part of the frame. However, in my circumstance, I can't really access anything in the frame. All I can really access is this little loop that's part of my hitch system. So that's what I use. I use that, but to mitigate the fact that it could be easily cut or attacked by a grinder, I make it extremely hard to access, and I'll show you what I mean. What I do is I take my chain, loop it through like that, and then I take my lock and I lock it like that and put the loop so that it's in the shackle with the chain. It's not exactly easy to do, but it protects the most vulnerable part of this whole locking setup. So as I do this, I'll also make sure that I'm facing the locking mechanism away so that it would be even harder for someone to pick. So there you go. I apologize, it was kind of hard to do on camera, but you can see that there's so much metal there and it's locked in such a way that it's very hard to access the steel underneath. Tip number 5 is to simply have some awareness of where you're going to be and use your best judgment on what kind of setup you need. Do you need a chain? I would recommend it all the time, but that's for you to decide. Do you live in a small town where it's very unlikely that there's going to be any crime? Or do you live in a bigger city? Or your lock? Do you need to spend $120 on a lock? how much bike are you locking up? For example, in this setup, I'm locking up my Trek, which is probably valued around $600. So I don't feel that it's necessary to spend a whole ton of money in order to lock up my bike. I do still think that a chain and a disc detainer lock is highly valuable, so that's what I choose. So for me, for the solution I've demonstrated, I feel very comfortable. For you, you'll have to take this information and formulate a solution that fits your individual circumstance. I'd love to know what you decide on in your locking setup, so let me know in the comments down below. Whatever you choose, I hope that you're now a little more comfortable making a purchase and deciding how you're going to lock your bike. As always, I'll put links in the description down below for the products that I've highlighted. And if you're just doing research or you're in the market for a used bike, hit the subscribe button down below and keep an eye out for my next video, which is going to include tips for how to purchase a bike on Facebook Marketplace. See you next time.